Okay, Reed Nelson again from my secret headquarters in Brazil. We're at springtime now, starting to warm up, and the mangoes are coming on. I've been out walking, and I'm sweaty and yucky, but it doesn't matter because from where you are, you can't smell me. Today, I'm going to talk a little bit about 2 Kings 4 as a model for the basic, most fundamental family business. The context is this. There's a widow, a lot of these widows in the Old Testament. There's a widow, and she has lots of debts, and the creditors are going to come and take her children to service the debt. They'll take them into slavery, I guess, to service the debt. So she calls, the prophet calls the man of God, and she says, my husband, who was a God-fearing good man, is dead, and I've got a lot of debt, and they're going to take my children. And so the man of God, being the holy and just and nice guy that he says, what do you want me to do? Which sounds pretty cold. I mean, couldn't he say, well, I'll tell you what, I'll go around to my fellow prophets and we'll take a collection and we'll pay off the debt. Or he could have, in good male prophet fashion, said, well, this is what you got to do. And instead, he puts it back in her lap. No matter how bad the crisis is, we have to be proactive. We have to think about what we want others to do and what we want to happen. Second, he asks another question. He then says, what do you have in your house? And this is another thing you do when you're in a crisis, or if you're going to try to start a business, you take inventory. What are your resources? And not what are the resources the bank has or the government has or that your friends have, but what do you have at home? In her case, it was easy. She said, oh, I've got a bottle of oil, nothing else. I'm broke, that's all I have. So he says, okay, let's work with the resources that you have. You always start with the resources you have immediately next to you, and you take an inventory of those. Then what he does is an interesting thing. He says, okay, and this is the second step. First, take inventory of what assets you have personally around you. And usually this is not just going to be physical assets. It's going to be things like talents, abilities, gifts, and so forth. And then he says, okay, now that you've done that first step of your own inventory, personal, you're proactive, you're thinking about what you can do. He says, okay. He says, now go to your neighbors and ask for all of the vessels they've got. Anything they've got that's empty, that will hold liquid, ask them for it. And that's the second step. You go to your immediate social network and you ask them, what emptiness do they have? What needs do they have? And you go to the entire network, you collect them, you say, get as many as you can, and you bring them here. And that's the second step. And of course, the third step is hopefully you're going to be able to fit the resources, the assets that you have with the needs that they have. Now notice, by the way, if you've been in the habit of borrowing stuff from your neighbors and never giving it back, if you're dishonest, if your neighbors don't like you, if you haven't been a good neighbor, if you haven't friends, this isn't going to work. The assumption here is that you are a decent individual and that you've developed a social network. If you don't have those two prerequisites, you're a decent individual and you got a social network, then you're in trouble. But those are two things that everybody should have: a network, friends, and decency. If you haven't got those assets, don't go into business. It ain't going to work. Or if it works for a little while, it won't work over the long term. So she goes out, she gets all these things from everybody else. And then the next step, he says, okay, now close the doors in your house. Now in this third phase, okay, you make contact with your network, with your neighbors. Now, the third phase, they're not involved though. You close the doors and windows in your house, and you take those resources that you have and you use them. So you're doing this by yourself, okay? By yourself or with your family. And then you take those resources and you use them to fulfill those needs. And in this case, there was, of course, divine intervention. She kept filling the vessels and filling the vessels and filling the vessels until they were all full. And she still had, and as soon as they were all full, then the resource ended. Again, a good business principle. As long as you're fulfilling a need, the gifts will come, your ability will come. If you've got that goal out there of fulfilling that need, things will keep moving and will move you until such time as those needs are filled, and then you'll have to stop and reassess. And then he said, okay, now you can open up the doors and go and sell the oil to everybody, and you've got a business, and you and your sons can live from that business. And so there was divine intervention in the first step, that multiplication of the talents of the oil. And then after that, then she had to go and buy oil elsewhere and presumably bottle it and sell it. But the model was established. Doesn't need any capital, doesn't do any borrowing, doesn't require that you open a physical location. Very low risk and a great way to start a business. Perhaps the best way to start a business, especially if you're in a pickle. If you don't have resources, it's not typically a good time to start a business. But if you're in a situation where you have to, that's the way you do it. Step one, assess resources, see what you've got that can be useful to others. Step two, go to your social network, find their emptiness. What are their empty vessels? What are their needs? Step three, you have a phase you do on your own where you fulfill those needs. Step four, give it back to the community, and then reassess and start the cycle all over again.